I kept my oath for most of my life, not because I believed in it forever, but because I believed that silence was safer than truth. That's how it works in places most people never see. You're taught early that the real secrets aren't the ones locked in safes. They're the ones men carry inside their heads. And if you carry them long enough, they become part of you. My name is Richard J. Wolfe. I served in the United States Air Force. Most of what I did doesn't appear anywhere in public records. That wasn't unusual. A lot of us operated in units that technically existed, but only on paper thin enough to disappear. I wasn't a scientist. I wasn't a strategist. And I certainly wasn't someone who made decisions. I followed orders. That's the job. But sometimes following orders means seeing things that were never meant to be seen by people like you. And once you see them, the silence stops being simple. It becomes a weight. The first time Greenland entered my life wasn't during a mission. It was during a briefing that technically never happened. This was years after my first deployments, when I had already learned the most important rule of certain operations. Don't ask questions that slow things down. The room was small, no windows, fluorescent lights that hummed like they were tired of staying on. There were only 6 of us inside, 2 officers I had never seen before, 1 intelligence liaison, 3 men like me, operational personnel. The man leading the briefing didn't introduce himself. He placed a thin folder on the table. No markings, no classification stamp. Nothing that suggested the documents inside were important. That alone told me they were. He opened the folder slowly and said something that didn't sound like a briefing line. He said, "Some discoveries don't belong to the country that finds them." No one spoke. He slid a photograph across the table. At first I thought it was satellite imagery, the kind you see in standard reconnaissance work. But the angle was wrong. The lighting suggested it had been taken from low altitude, not orbit. And what it showed didn't make sense. A massive geometric structure embedded in ice, not partially exposed, buried. You could see the outline through layers of frozen compression, like something ancient trapped in glass. It wasn't natural. I had spent enough time around terrain analysis to know that. Natural formations don't form angles like that, not at that scale. Someone beside me shifted in his chair. The officer ignored it. He pointed to a second photograph. This one was taken from inside something. Metal corridors, dark surfaces, smooth walls with no visible seams. And then he said the sentence that stayed with me for decades. Chinese survey teams reported the first entry point. Not we discovered it. Not our teams found it. Chinese teams. At the time, that made even less sense than the images. Greenland had always been strategically important, yes. Radar installations, early warning systems. But this wasn't a military facility, and it wasn't something modern either. The intelligence officer finally spoke. He said the Chinese presence there wasn't officially acknowledged. Their operation had been disguised as a geological survey, standard cover. But their ground sensors detected something beneath the ice sheet that shouldn't have been there. Density readings inconsistent with rock, perfect symmetry. Structures buried miles below compressed ice layers older than recorded human construction. They drilled, carefully, slowly. What they reached wasn't rock. It was a cavity, not empty, engineered. The room went quiet after that, because even before anyone said the word, we all understood what the implication was. If a structure existed that deep beneath Greenland's ice, it had to be older than the ice above it, much older. Older than any civilization we know. The officer closed the folder halfway and looked at us, not like a commander, more like a man measuring reactions. And he said something that changed the tone of the entire briefing. The Chinese went to first to know about it. That line hung in the air longer than anything else, because if they weren't the first, then someone had known before them, someone who had kept it quiet, someone who had watched the ice for a long time. That was the moment I understood something I hadn't expected when I first joined the Air Force. Some operations aren't about defense. They're about containment. Containment of knowledge, containment of history, containment of questions. The officer closed the folder. "Your role," he said, "is observation and recovery if necessary." No further explanation, no discussion, just a quiet instruction that sounded routine until you thought about what it meant. Recovery of what? Artifacts, technology, bodies? No one asked, because by then we had already learned the rule. If the briefing doesn't include the answer, you weren't meant to know it. But as we stood up to leave, the intelligence officer added something that never appeared in any written report, something he said almost casually. The Chinese team reported movement inside the structure. Movement. Beneath ice older than civilization, inside a structure that shouldn't exist. No one in that room laughed. No one called it impossible, because the men giving that briefing weren't the kind who entertained imagination. They dealt in confirmed information, which meant one possibility had already been accepted. Something was down there, something built long before we arrived, and something inside it was not entirely still. I remember walking out of that room thinking about one question, not what we were going to find, but something far simpler. If the Chinese discovered the entrance, and we already knew about the structure, then how long had someone been watching it? And why had they waited so long to go inside? Most people think operations begin with deployment. They don't. They begin long before anyone boards an aircraft, long before equipment is packed or coordinates are confirmed. They begin the moment someone decides that a secret is ready to move. And in the case of Greenland, that decision had already been made years earlier. I learned that slowly, not through briefings, but through fragments, side comments, documents left open a few seconds longer than necessary. That's how truth leaks inside systems built to contain it. The flight itself was quiet, no unit insignia, no clear mission profile. Just a transport aircraft heading north over water that looked black even in daylight. Most of the men on board were the kind you see in operations that don't officially exist. Minimal conversation, no curiosity. People assume soldiers talk a lot before a mission. In some units, that's true. In others, silence is the language. Greenland appeared below us hours later, endless white, not the romantic kind you see in documentaries. This was something heavier. Flat horizons, wind carving lines across frozen terrain that hadn't changed in thousands of years. There's something about ice that old. It doesn't feel empty. It feels like a record, like the ground remembers everything that ever happened above it. Our landing site wasn't one of the known installations, not Pacific Space Base, which most people still remember by its old name, Thule Air Base. Those places operate under official structures, personnel rotations, clear chains of command. Where we landed had none of that. Temporary structures, heavy drilling equipment, mobile power units, satellite dishes pointing toward skies that never seemed completely dark. And people, not just Americans. That was the first thing I noticed when we stepped off the aircraft. The second thing I noticed was how everyone avoided eye contact. He learned to read posture after years in uniform, and these people carried the posture of individuals who had already seen something they wished they hadn't. One of the officers walked us across the ice toward a series of reinforced tents. Inside, the temperature was warmer, but the atmosphere felt colder. Maps covered the tables, cross-sections of ice layers, depth calculations, structural diagrams that looked nothing like geological formations. One of the engineers pointed at the largest diagram. "You're looking at roughly 2 miles of compressed ice above the chamber." 2 miles. That kind of pressure turns ice into something closer to stone. which meant whatever structure was beneath it had survived unimaginable weight for thousands of years, maybe longer. Someone asked the question that had been sitting quietly in everyone's mind. How did the Chinese reach it first? The engineer shrugged. Luck. But the intelligence officer standing beside him shook his head slightly. Not luck, he said. Persistence. He explained that Chinese survey teams had been conducting deep ice resonance scans across several regions of Greenland. Officially, they were studying glacial stability. Unofficially, they were searching for anomalies. Their instruments picked up geometric reflections that didn't behave like natural cavities, straight lines, uniform angles, repeating structural patterns. That's when they started drilling, but they never expected what came next. When their drill finally broke through the last layer of ice, the sensor feed changed. The drill bit entered open space, a hollow chamber, artificial, and according to the Chinese report we intercepted, massive, larger than the largest underground hangars ever built by human hands. At that point, our intelligence community moved quickly. Monitoring satellites shifted position, communications intercepts intensified, and within weeks the United States had established its own operation on the ice, quietly, without announcements, without official acknowledgement. That's the operation I was standing inside. The engineer pointed to a narrow shaft on the diagram. That's the entry point. A vertical tunnel drilled through miles of ice, reinforced with steel rings, descending into darkness. But the part that unsettled me most wasn't the depth. It was the date printed beside the Chinese drilling logs. The cavity had been breached months earlier, which meant someone had already gone down there. Someone had already entered the structure. I asked the question carefully. What did they find? The room went quiet again. Not the awkward silence of uncertainty, the deliberate silence of people deciding what they're allowed to say. Finally, the intelligence officer answered. They didn't stay long. That wasn't really an answer, but no one pushed him. He walked to another table and picked up a tablet. Then he turned the screen toward us. It showed interior footage, dark metallic surfaces, a corridor that curved slightly downward, disappearing into shadow. The lighting came from portable flood lamps placed along the floor. And at the far edge of the image, something moved, not quickly, not clearly, just enough to make you wonder if it was a shadow or something passing between the lights. The officer locked the screen and placed the tablet back on the table. The Chinese team reported equipment malfunctions and environmental instability inside the structure. That was the official explanation. Equipment failure, environmental instability. But the way he said it made something obvious. Those weren't the real reasons they left. Then he added the sentence that none of us expected. They also reported hearing internal sounds. Metal resonance, low-frequency vibrations, movement deep inside sections of the structure they never reached. He paused before continuing. And one more thing. Now the room was completely still. The structure appears powered. Beneath 2 miles of ice, in a place where no civilization should ever have existed. For the first time since arriving, I felt something unfamiliar. Not fear, not exactly. Something closer to realization. Because if that structure was still active, then whatever built it didn't just disappear. Or if it did, it left something behind. That night, lying in a temporary bunk while wind howled across the ice above us, I kept thinking about the footage on that tablet. That faint movement at the end of the corridor, the way the shadows shifted between the floodlights, and one thought kept returning to me. Not a dramatic one, just a simple question that refused to go away. If the Chinese only explored the first corridors, then how far did the structure actually go beneath the ice? And more importantly, what was still moving in the parts no one had reached yet? People imagine discoveries happen in bright laboratories, white walls, scientists talking into microphones, cameras recording history. That's not how this one began. It began with a metal cage hanging over a hole in the ice. No ceremony, no speeches, just wind cutting across the drilling platform, and a group of men pretending not to think too much about what waited 2 miles below them. The shaft had been reinforced with steel rings every few meters. Without that reinforcement, the pressure from the surrounding ice would have collapsed it within weeks. Standing at the edge of it, you couldn't see the bottom, just darkness and the distant echo of machinery. The engineer explained the descent would take almost 40 minutes. That number stayed with me. 40 minutes moving downward into something that shouldn't exist. I was part of the second team scheduled to go down. The first team had already entered the structure the day before. When they came back up, they didn't say much. One of them sat alone for nearly an hour outside the main tent, staring at the ice like he was trying to remember how the world used to look. No one asked him anything. In operations like that, silence is sometimes the only report you get. When it was our turn, 4 of us stepped into the cage, 2 security personnel, 1 engineer, and me. I remember the officer standing near the winch system saying something simple before the descent began. Observe, document, do not improvise. Then the cage began to lower. At first the shaft walls looked rough and cloudy, layers of compressed ice forming pale bands around us. Ancient snowfall turned into stone. Each meter downward was like moving deeper into time. The light from the surface faded slowly until only the lamps attached to the cage illuminated the tunnel. After 20 minutes, the ice changed color, darker, denser. The engineer said something quietly over the headset. These layers are older than the last ice age. I didn't respond. I was looking at something else. Marks in the ice. Not cracks, not natural fractures. Lines, straight, parallel, running vertically along sections of the shaft wall where the drill had exposed something buried inside the ice. Metal. Not a lot of it, just fragments. Like pieces of something larger that had once been there before the ice swallowed it. The engineer noticed it too. He leaned forward and shined his lamp closer. Structural debris, he muttered. But that explanation didn't feel right. Debris implies collapse. This looked integrated, like parts of a larger structure extending upward through the ice itself. The cage kept descending. 30 minutes, 35. By then, the temperature readings had stabilized in a way the engineer said shouldn't be possible. It was warmer than expected. Not warm enough to melt ice, but warmer than 2 miles below the surface should be. He checked his instruments twice. Something down there is generating heat. No one answered. The winch system slowed. A dull echo began rising from below. Not a mechanical sound, more like distant resonance, the kind you hear when wind moves through a hollow chamber. Then the floor appeared beneath us. The cage touched down with a soft metallic thud, and suddenly the shaft walls ended. We stepped out into a space that no human construction team had ever documented. The chamber ceiling rose high above the reach of our lights. The walls curved inward like the interior of an enormous shell. And the floor beneath our boots wasn't ice. It was metal, not rusted, not corroded, perfectly smooth. The engineer knelt and ran his glove across it. No oxidation, he whispered. That alone didn't make sense. Metal buried under ice for thousands of years should show some form of degradation. This surface looked untouched, like it had been placed there yesterday. Portable lights from the first team illuminated a narrow corridor leading deeper into the structure. The same corridor I had seen on the tablet during the briefing. Seeing it in person was different. Images flatten reality, but standing there, you could feel the scale. The corridor walls was seamless, no rivets, no panels, just a continuous surface that curved slightly inward as it stretched away from the chamber. I remember thinking something strange at that moment. Not about aliens, not about ancient civilizations, just about engineering. Because whoever built that place understood materials and structural stress in ways far beyond anything I had seen during my time in the Air Force. The first team had placed markers along the corridor floor. We followed them slowly. Our boots echoed softly against the metal surface. Each step carried a hollow resonance that traveled farther than it should have, like the structure was amplifying sound, or listening to it. After a few minutes, we reached a junction where the corridor widened into another chamber. And that's where we found the first thing that made the engineers stop walking. In the center of the room stood a circular structure about 15 feet across, a raised platform. The surface was covered with patterns, not writing, not symbols exactly, more like geometric pathways carved into the metal, concentric lines intersecting at precise angles. The engineer crouched beside it, shining his lamp along the grooves. "Energy distribution," he murmured. He didn't sound certain, but he sounded disturbed. Because the patterns weren't decorative, they had purpose. Something had once moved through those channels, something powerful enough to leave faint discoloration in the metal. Then the security officer beside me said something quietly. "Do you hear that?" We all stopped moving. At first I thought it was the sound of our breathing inside the helmets, but then I noticed it too, a vibration, very low, so low you felt it more than you heard it. It seemed to come from deeper inside the structure. A slow pulse moving through the floor beneath our boots. The engineer checked his instruments again. His voice dropped almost to a whisper. "The power readings are higher down there." Down there. Further into the corridor network. Further into a structure no one had mapped. Further into a place that had been buried under Greenland's ice longer than human history. We stood there for several seconds without speaking. Not because we were afraid, but because we all understood something at the same time. The structure wasn't dead. It was still active. Maybe not fully, maybe not in the way it once was, but something inside it was still functioning, and something inside it was still generating energy. That's when the radio in the engineer's suit crackled. The voice from the surface sounded tense. "Team 2, confirm status." The engineer hesitated before answering. "We've entered the main chamber. Structure appears stable. Power signatures present." There was a long pause. Then the voice from above asked a question that changed the mood instantly. "Have you encountered any internal movement?" The engineer looked at me, then at the corridor stretching deeper into darkness. Finally, he answered, "Negative." Technically, that was true. We hadn't seen anything move. But standing there, listening to that low vibration traveling through the floor, I couldn't shake the feeling that the structure itself was breathing, slow, ancient, patient. And as we prepared to move deeper into the corridor network, one thought settled quietly in the back of my mind. Not fear, not excitement, just a realization that felt heavier than either. If that place had been active beneath the ice for thousands of years, then maybe it wasn't waiting for us to find it. Maybe it had always known we would eventually come down there. And maybe the real question wasn't what we would discover inside that structure. Maybe the real question was something far more uncomfortable. When we finally reached the center of it, would we be the first visitors it had seen in all that time? Or the second? There's a moment in certain operations when everyone present understands the same thing at the same time. No one says it out loud, no one writes it in a report, but the atmosphere changes. The corridor ahead of us felt like that moment. The vibration under our boots grew slightly stronger the deeper we moved into the structure. Still subtle, but impossible to ignore once you noticed it. The engineer kept checking his instruments. Power readings were increasing, not dramatically, but steadily, which meant whatever energy source existed inside the structure was somewhere further ahead. The corridor curved downward after another 100 yards. That detail bothered me more than anything else. Structures built underground usually level out. They expand horizontally. This one descended. Like the chamber we had entered was only the upper layer of something much larger. The security officer walking behind me muttered something under his breath. Feels like we're going deeper into a machine. No one corrected him, because that was exactly what it felt like. Not a ruin, not an archaeological site. A system. Something designed with purpose. The walls began to change texture as we moved. The smooth metal surfaces developed faint ridges, not random ones. They followed repeating patterns along the corridor, lines that reminded me of cooling channels in high-temperature equipment, except these grooves were far more precise. The engineer ran his hand across one section and quietly said something that stayed with me. This wasn't built with cutting tools. He didn't explain what he meant, but I understood the implication. Human manufacturing leaves marks, microscopic imperfections. These surfaces didn't have any. It was like the material had been shaped, not carved. After another few minutes, the corridor opened into a space so large our lights couldn't reach the far walls. The floor sloped gently downward into a circular chamber, and at the center of that chamber stood something none of us were prepared to see. A structure rising from the floor like a column, 30 feet tall, maybe more. Its surface wasn't solid metal like the rest of the complex. It looked layered, almost organic. Thin segments stacked on top of each other in concentric rings, each ring slightly offset from the one below it. And between those rings, light, faint, pale blue. The engineer stopped walking immediately. His instruments began emitting short warning tones. "Energy spike," he said quietly. The vibration we had been feeling was stronger here. It pulsed through the floor at steady intervals, not random, rhythmic, like something cycling. The security officer lifted his rifle slightly, more out of instinct than necessity. Weapons felt useless in a place like that. I remember standing there trying to understand what I was looking at. Not as a soldier, just as a human being. Because whatever that column was, it wasn't ancient in the way ruins are ancient. Ruins decay. This thing looked operational, alive in a mechanical sense. The engineer circled it slowly, scanning every surface. "No corrosion," he said again. Then he pointed toward the base. That's when I noticed the openings. 3 narrow passages cut into the floor around the column, each one leading further downward. 3 tunnels descending beneath the chamber. The structure above was only part of it. The real depth continued below. The engineer's voice was almost uneasy when he spoke again. "This is a distribution hub." "Distribution of what?" one of the security men asked. He didn't answer immediately. He just stared at the glowing rings. Finally, he said something none of us expected. "Power. Or signal." "Signal."